On a hill, two souls stood together, like one whole from a distance. Below them, concealed by the darkness, was a farmstead that the two shadows could not see. Silently lurking like predators, poised to attack their victim. From a distance, it is barely perceptible that one of the two shadows is holding a single torch to light their surroundings. "Sayura, I don't think we should do this." The two shadows exchanged words. With a loud sigh, the other said, "We have to, Barseek. Do you not remember what they did to us?" "What have they done to you?" cried the shadow. "I understand, but I have no desire to return. I believe that this was over." Barseek thought. "I might be, but you could never be through with this, with what you are," Sayura said with a sly smile. "It was you who informed me that only the dead would witness the conclusion of the conflict." He pleaded, "Sire," but she interrupted him. She tore open her shirt as she said, "Listen, I hate to do this, but you're making me, and I only do this because I love you. Now let me remind you what they've done." He tried to turn away, but she yelled at him to keep his eyes on her nude body. "Now don't dare turn your head away. That's what they took from you, Barseek, and that's what they did to me." As he stood there, staring at her, defenseless against the impending flood of memories, she screamed and pointed to his prosthetic arm. "You're right," he admitted, looking down at the farmland. A part of him that he had attempted to hide deep inside his thoughts was starting to break. His mind suddenly focused on a horrible person he was trying to forget. While hiding once more, Sayura said, "And besides, you promised me we'd do this and you can't back out now." Her friend bemoaned, "You're right again." "Why do you have to be right all the time, Sayura?" His voice was cracking as he said this. With flames flickering in his eyes, he yelled at her, "Sayura, I hate how right you are all the goddamn time." Barseek's visage twisted into the face of a vampiric demon on the edge of starvation-induced insanity, and unquenchable hatred flames flickered in his eyes. When Sayura noticed how her friend had changed, she couldn't help but laugh like a child once more. As she watched him sprint down the hill with the torch in his hand, she joked, "Because someone has to be, don't you think?" He appeared to resemble a falling star from a distance. He soon disappeared completely, vanishing into the night a considerable distance from the homestead, but Sayura was aware of where to locate her friend. Particularly in this condition, she always knew where to look for him. She just needed to follow the yelling. She listened for the yelling as she descended the slope slowly, becoming enthralled with the thought of the cruel punishment Barseek was delivering in her name to those who had mistreated them and those who had wronged her. For as long as she could recall, they were always this way in her mind, one soul divided between two bodies. Since she first met him all those years ago, when he was still a juvenile soldier, things have always been this way for her. They were and will always be a part of the same whole, in her opinion. By the time she arrived at the farmstead, the shrieking had become nearly intolerable. Barseek took his sweet time carrying out their retaliation. To make their pain last longer, he took care to seriously hurt them. As she set out to trample on everyone in her way, Sayura was extremely careful not to tend to any of the dead men who were laying on the ground. An almost intentional scattering of blood, guts, and severed limbs was observed. Barseek built a bloody path for his lone companion to walk, using human feces. By the time she got to him, He was covered in blood and fighting with a sword against an elderly man who was having a hard time keeping his composure against a much younger opponent. The room was filled with the man's wife's constant cries. Sayura knelt before the woman and blew a kiss at Barsik. The elderly man's blade briefly struck his face as he briefly shifted his focus from his opponent to her. It was nearly more offensive than anything else because it only scraped the young warrior's face. He ought not to have done that. To the sobbing woman who didn't even appear to notice her, Sayura made a joke. Barsik barely noticed the pain, pausing briefly to inhale deeply before slicing his blade through his opponent to a cacophony of sobbing, jumbled words. I suppose he didn't show you enough love. Mommy. The sobbing woman was reprimanded by Sayura, who still didn't appear to notice. And now he passes away. Barsik severed the man's head as her words reverberated across the room like an order or a signal. To Sayura's sick satisfaction, the woman let out an inhuman screech as she watched her husband's severed skull fall to the ground. Would you look at that, like daughter, like mother? She yelled at her companion, who appeared to find the chaos he had created equally amusing. Barsik was not yet content with the destruction he had brought about, so he turned to face the woman and stood over her, his eyes flaming with need. His heart was unyielding even as she pleaded for her life. Despite his cruelty, this devil showed more mercy than she did. The murder came to an abrupt halt when he quickly swung his blade and severed her skull. By daybreak, Barsik and Sayura had long since vanished, two shadows snuggled as close as one. They walked unseen to the one location where they could both find serenity, almost like two spirits in one body. The entrance to the country of the pure and the world of the living. After arriving, the shadow crept gently in the direction of a grave at the base of a frangipani tree. Sayura, I told you. Barsik bemoaned as he carefully placed two skulls at the base of the tomb that held his sole companion. I told you I'll lay their skulls at your feet. Peter's fingers clutched the torn mechanical manual from the 1970s, and the air between the pages patted the close. Another miss, another book. The faint sound rippled between the inexpensive pressboard shelves covered in black powder-coated steel, echoing ever so slightly throughout the library. A woman with bespectacles and frizzy, graying hair tied up in a sloppy bob scowled at him from the door. Although he had never really cared to introduce himself, he was a frequent visitor. Furthermore, he wasn't actually present for the books. He smiled mischievously and put the book back on the shelf. He would return for another shelf check the next time. The fact that he had never checked anything out or sat down to read might have raised doubts in her mind, but he didn't care. He had spent almost every day there lately, searching through almost every shelf, to the point where it was getting old. Maybe, after all, it was time to go somewhere else. As he turned on his heels and headed for the exit, his sneakers scraped across the polished concrete flooring. He was walking into the earthy notes of espresso that permeated the air from the small cafe at the entrance. Like every coffee shop, some patrons sipped their lattes while reading a book they had just taken off the shelves, while aspiring writers labored on their laptops covered in stickers, working on something that probably few people would actually care about. Time slowed to a standstill in this mental warehouse as people bustled by outside the windows, cars a mere blur. His senses shifted to everything around him as he pushed open the doors to the outside world again. The crunching of car tires on the asphalt and their droning engines, the smell of car exhaust and the sewers below, the whispered conversations of people in the streets, the warmth of the sun peeking between the high-rises buffeting his bare skin. Although he was a tiny part of this place, which was his home, Peter had a slightly different perspective on the world than most. He loved exercising parkour, exploring parks and marinas, and using the city as his own playground. A shop's projecting sign may serve as a swing or aid in pulling him up, or a parked car could be an invitation to verticality. He enjoyed the gratifying rhythm of movement as he skillfully vaulted over walls and seats. He went from a climb up to a quick wall run, climbing the side of a brick fountain to briefly rest on its edge, and the sound of his worn Converse hitting the concrete was almost melodic. He also liked to explore the city, looking for abandoned roofs and secret passageways where the city's more subdued, secluded side might be seen. But his favorite spots were rooftops, where he could see the expansive metropolis below from above as people scurried about. A viewpoint completely lost on people below him, the streets and roads were like the circulatory system to a living, vibrant entity. He would stop there, amid the old chimneys and antennae, to take in the cool air and observe the skyline as it glowed in the waning light. Every new location he discovered seemed to be a gift from God, a balance of adventure and peace that only he seemed to be aware of. But lately, his fascination with libraries sprang from an apparently impromptu interest. He liked to gather insects that perished in the spaces between ancient books. He couldn't stop thinking about them late into the night since there was something so intriguing about them. His method of preserving them was a painstaking regimen that he had developed over months of patience and effort. Every specimen was treated with extreme caution. He visited libraries and used bookstores, where he could spend endless hours searching through ancient books in the hopes of finding them. He prepped them for preservation back in his office, a neat area with shelves of labeled jars and shadow boxes. In order to install the insects in glass frames, he would carefully position them on a foam board and secure them with small adhesive pads or pins so that they appeared to float in place. The vivid colors, complex patterns, and minute details of the insects, from the delicate veins of a moth's wings to the iridescent shine of a beetle's shell, were displayed in each frame, which was an artistic creation. His meticulous handwriting was evidence of his commitment, as he labeled each item with its scientific designation and the place of discovery. Although he had never shown anyone all of his hard work, the completed frames were arranged around the walls of his tiny flat. However, this passion and obsession were solely for him and not for anyone else. He had been doing it long enough to start running into problems finding the books he needed because his local library was starting to run low on the kinds of books he would normally locate. He needed something older, something that had been read and put down with a small life snuffed out accidentally or otherwise. There was little use in reading more recent books, even though the odd insect might make its way through the manufacturing process, squeezed and desiccated between the pages of some self-congratulatory autobiography or pseudoscientific self-help book. Particularly remarkable were the vintage ones, which led him to reflect on how the bug got there and the path its life and death had gone before he could categorize and appreciate it. He didn't particularly enjoy the thought of being the only one in a musty old vintage bookstore, but he was scrutinized as he quickly turned each page and felt for the smallest bump between the pages to find his target, staring at him as if he were going to commit a crime. No, they wouldn't comprehend. But there was a spot he loved to visit on his way home. They seemed to care about how they made their coffee, and it wasn't as processed as the garbage at the library. Among the artificial lights, ads, concrete structures, and the disconnected conduct of daily life, it was a place unto itself, not there for convenience. Even better, they possessed an assortment of vintage books. Even though they were more ornamental than functional, Peter always looked through them. Peter inhaled deeply in a whooshing nasal breath as he entered the dingy rectangular space with its chipped tables and ragged leather-seated seats, their ebony lacquer breaking away. It had a distinct scent that he couldn't locate anywhere else. It was earthy, spicy, and slightly musk-like. A half-smiling tattooed man in a shirt and vest at the bar nodded at him. One side of his hair was shaved short, while the other fell to one side. He had a knotted leather bracelet on one hand and orange spacers that blew up the size of his ears. Vance. Even though he hadn't given a damn about the patrons in the library, he had to talk to Vance in order to place his coffee order. Over the preceding 6 months, they had been acquainted, however briefly, at a distance. During that time, he had been kind enough to give Peter a few new books, one of which even contained a tiny cricket. Normal? Vance let out a grunt. Normal, Peter answered. He nodded, dug under the bar, and took out a circular cup of ivory. He then turned around and tinkled with the espresso machine at the rear. Since that seems to be your kind of thing, there are a couple new books in the back booth. The grounds from the last coffee were tapped out. I'll bring it over, go ahead. Peter strolled by many vacant booths, one of which had an elderly man sitting in it. The man turned languidly and gave him a half-smile. It was abnormally quiet, yet it wasn't the busiest place. He carefully positioned the books on the seat in front of him, stacking them neatly on the left side of the table after removing the disorganized stack from the shelf above each seat. He got to work, the leather creaking and squeaking beneath him. He started by reading the names on the spines and throwing some of them away in a different pile that he had already looked over. However, Vance was correct. The majority of these were novel. He began to open them one by one. He had become used to the sensation of distinct paper grains from different eras, and the musty smells that were preserved between the pages told him a story about the book's history. He was shocked to discover that he had found something quickly, this time a cockroach. Someone pushed it in, then quickly closed the lid, and it was an adolescent, probably scooped between the pages in terror. He carefully removed a tiny pouch from the inside of his jacket while observing the faded splatter surrounding it and the way its legs were snapped backwards. He began working with tweezers in his hand and an empty plastic bag on the table. "Did you find what you were looking for?" a voice to his right informed him. Before it came out, it echoed around his throat, deep and thick. Although his accent was heavy, Peter dropped his tweezers due to the abruptness of his call. It was an aged black man with profound facial creases that resembled canyons. He wasn't sure if the smile was kind or predatory, but it was made up of thick lips, and yellow teeth showed through. He had spots of gray beard hair that he had missed shaving and a big pair of fully opaque sunglasses on his face. Wispy tufts of curled gray hair protruded from below the brown-gray pinstripe fedora that matched his outfit, which lay atop his probably bald head. A thin, light, but twisted and gnarled wooden stick was clutched in one hand. Although it appeared to have been carved from some sort of driftwood, Peter was unable to identify the distinctive patterns that were used. He was unsure of how to respond to the query. How could he tell what he was searching for? If he was searching for a smashed bug, how would it appear? In his terror, words just flowed out of him, as if they were drawn from the man himself. No. Not exactly. He glanced at the cockroach below. Perhaps. He continued, gathering his composure and displaying a hint of irritation as he looked back up at the unidentified man. I'm not sure. He instinctively shook his head. I apologize, but who are you? The sputters were deep and rumbling as the man laughed to himself. I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt. He reached into the outfit. He gave Peter a clean white card that was tenderly gripped in his big fingers as they withdrew. Mend is my name. Using 2 fingers, he moved the card across the table. I enjoy reading. Actually, I have a pretty impressive collection. But you're blind, don't you? Peter made up and down motions with his fingers before realizing the man couldn't even see him. He chuckled once more. I wasn't always. But I know who you are. Your speech and mannerisms. He smiled even more broadly. The library. Peter's face was scowling. In the hopes that his coffee would be ready and he could get rid of this guy, he leaned to one side to give Vance a questioning look, but Vance was not there. I used to love reading, and I have a sizable library. You could find what you're looking for there, so stop by. You believe that I will simply appear at some dash. Peter started to speak, but the man interrupted him by tapping his cane against the table. He emphasized, I mean no harm to you. I'm merely a person who shares similar interests. A unique one. With another smile, he clamped his fingers into a claw on the top of his cane. Hopefully, I'll see you soon. After a few days of trying to summon the bravery to show up, Peter checked the card he had tucked beneath his laptop every night, wondering what could possibly go wrong. He had even searched for the place online, looking at images of the area. It was a brick and wood, 2-story house from the late 19th century with a tall chimney and a towered room. Although it didn't appear particularly worn out considering its age, the yellowed lace that hung behind the window could be replaced with new curtains and a coat of paint. Finally, he slipped the card back into his pocket and grasped the chilly iron as he stood at the iron gate, staring down at the card and back up the gravel path to the home. He took sure to lock the rusted entryway behind him as it swung open with a yell. As he walked near the man's house, the ground crushed beneath his feet. He stopped to think for a second, but he still ended up pounding on the door. Men unlocked the door and heard footsteps approaching from inside, followed by a clicking and rattling sound. Hello. Don't worry about the shoes and come in. He grinned. The door clicked shut behind him. It was a reasonably clean house. In the hallway, a small cupboard hugged the wall to the kitchen, and a rotary phone rested on a little table. In the living room, Peter could see an antique radio blaring in French next to a deep green sofa with lace coverings draped over the arms. Taking everything into account, it wasn't poorly decorated, however the walls appeared quite empty. In any case, that wouldn't help him. Men turned a brass key he had left in the door and cautiously moved to a white door set into the paneling underneath the stairs. He smiled and gestured toward it as it swung outward. "Everything is down there. There is a small item to satisfy any fancy. Now, since I can't appreciate it, I'm just happy to meet someone who can." Peter remained quite apprehensive. The light switch was outside, next to the door frame, but men still hadn't turned it on, perhaps out of habit. "Go ahead, and I'll be right behind you. Not providing refreshments to a visitor in my house is impolite, in my opinion." "Oh, I'm all right." Peter admitted that he didn't fully trust the man, but also didn't want to come out as impolite. "I demand it." Grinning, he made his way back to the kitchen. Peter turned off the light switch and saw that his host had left, revealing a dusty wooden stairway that descended into the brick cellar. He finally started to descend slowly, step by step, holding onto the dusty wooden railing. The basement appeared steadily. There was a single workstation at the far end, shelves full of books, and pile after pile of volumes illuminated by a single halogen bulb. Thick cobwebs ran the length of the room like a fibrous tissue, holding the carapaces of starving spiders to the sandy layer of dust that covered everything. Like the imposing structures of the city, square shadows loomed against the brick in the twilight sky, and Peter pondered how long this place had been unaltered. The basement, a sizable rectangle with a metal pole supporting the roof, was a sterile space that seemed out of keeping with the old manuscripts kept below. He headed to the mahogany desk at the very back of the room since he wasn't sure where to begin. There was a book on top of it out of all the volumes in the basement. He had never seen anything like it. He couldn't keep his eyes off it, so he pushed the chair back, sat down, and carefully raised it. The inscription on the spine was so worn that it appeared to be undamaged. As soon as he turned to the first page, he realized that this was unlike anything else he had ever seen. The writing inside was handwritten on vellum sheets rather than typed or printed, and it felt smooth and almost slick against his touch. The script looked to be somewhere between Sanskrit and Tagalog, with whirling letters, double-crossed lines, slanted dots, and little markings above or below some characters, yet he squinted and tried to read it through the inky yellowed light. He had never seen anything like it. From behind him, a voice asked, "So, do you like my collection?" He recognized it right away as not being manned. Something about the voice sounded like a guttural clicking, a croaking snarl. He spun the chair around while gripping the table with one hand, and even if it wasn't obviously masculine or female, it was enough to make his heart leap out of his throat. He saw a towering figure when he looked up, but the intense light from above was too bright for his eyes to adjust to. The halogen's illumination softened the silhouette of the hooded shape, which was sinuous and gangly. A chilly hand extended toward his shoulder. As the figure moved closer, he sank farther into his seat, paralyzed by terror and unable to gaze through the darkness or turn away. "I understand what you're trying to find." Almost urgently, the hand grabbed and squeezed against his shoulder. They laughed breathily and hissed to themselves, "What am I looking for?" "Our eyes." They raised their other hand. Peter noticed that the figure's hood was reached by long, threatening talons. They took a step to the side and took it off. The light was sufficient to partially illuminate a portion of their face as it scooped around them. They had chitin instead of skin. thick hairs sprang out of a solid plate of charcoal black armor. All 5 of its eye sockets were concave. They were either pushed in or completely absent, creating a hollow pit. He instantly searched his mind for any species to which this thing might be linked, but he was not familiar with its layout. His survival was more important than how such a monster existed. At that moment, his only concern was getting away. To read my books, I need eyes. You look for books, but you never read them. The hand scooped its fingers around his cheek and reached up to his face. Though not as frigid as he had thought they might be, they felt hard. His eyes grew wide as he frantically gazed down at the visible wrist, devising a strategy for getting away. I feel sorry for you. Before he could try to seize them and throw them aside, they stood up straight. You disregard so much wisdom. But don't think I'm being unjust. They gave a hiss. I'll give you an opportunity. They delicately clutched a brass hourglass from the top of their cloak as they reached into it. You are welcome to leave my library if you are able to do so before I catch you. Your eyes will be mine if not. Additionally, I can hear you and smell you, so don't even try to hide. The mandibles hanging from their face trembled and clackered as they leaned in once more. I taste you in the atmosphere. Already, Peter's heart was pounding rapidly. He didn't even need the advantage. The stairs were right there, but the anxiety was enough to make him perspire. He was covered in darkness when the monster in front of him took off their cloak. The only sound coming from the other side for a little period was the clacking and ticking of their noises, but they quickly threw it away. He squinted through the blinding light to see the far wall with the stairs moving away from him, the wall stretching, and the floor pulling back as the ceiling rose higher and higher. The light continued to shine with the same ferocity as the summer sun, but it was getting farther away. What the fuck? He shouted to himself. His gaze shifted back to the monstrous monster in front of him. They shook a fattened thorax behind them as they lowered themselves onto 3 pairs of legs that culminated in claws for climbing and grabbing. Their head moved from side to side, and each leg had spiked hairs sticking out. The way it was constructed, he knew it would be quick. With each step, the legs could cover a lot of territory, and their length and slenderness belied the muscle that was inside them. The hunt begins when I hear the final grain of sand fall. Ready to start, the creature's claws grasped the timer from the bottom. It started with a spectacular lift and smash back down. Using the chair's wheels to obtain a rolling start, Peter pushed himself off the table and began to run. His gaze swept quickly over the sight before him. The floor was covered with enormous dune-like piles of books, towering bookshelves that stretched as far as he could see, and shelves that continued to sprout out of thin air before falling into a pile with the others. His frantic breathing was drowned out by the sound of pages turning and bookcases toppling all around him. As he passed several bookshelves with leather-bound tomes that were old and gnarled, sprouting out of the earth, a more open path appeared to the left between them. To shave off as much distance as he could, he would need to maintain his straightest posture, but he already knew it would be difficult. A shelf already barred his view of what was ahead, but there was a passage to its right. Careful not to trip over any of the numerous books already strewn across the floor, he sped past it, hooked himself around, and then ran forward, holding out a hand to swing around it. Books clattered to the floor behind him as he rushed past shelf after shelf, the colors of the spines a mere blur. In front of him, a tall, thin shelf was already falling over, tilting to the side, and stacks of paper were flying everywhere. As it crashed into other units, he quickly estimated how long it would take to strike the wall and pushed himself harder, barely avoiding it and sending more to the concrete floor. He could see more shelves rising far up into the roof and bursting open, dumping a torrent of literature, and above that, there was a small open space with a mountain of books. Fuck. With a sigh, he jumped and threw himself at the mound. He scarcely moved as he scrambled, kicking and pulling against shifting volumes. The earth was shifting beneath him with every move he made, and his fumbling and scumbling was not helping him. He made himself more methodical by drawing nearer and lowering his center of gravity. He wisely took his time and pressed down against the hardbacks as he ascended. He moved steadily toward the top, much too slowly considering the creature's impending charge. He briefly glanced in the direction of what appeared to be a route, but everything was changing and twisting too quickly. It would have already distorted and morphed into something completely different by the time he arrived anywhere. Up was the best way, he thought. Another shelf rose up from behind the pile of books below him. Leaning forward to make a deliberate leap forward, he grabbed the top of the shelf and scrambled up after launching himself forward and landing on his heels to ride down across the hill's surface. The cracking sound made him more afraid, and he could feel the metal beneath him start to give way. It started to fall forward, and he would fall 3 floors to the pavement below if he didn't take quick action. He waited a moment, looking about as fast as he could, and then he leaned just in time to seize another high shelf in front of him. He was far from the top, but that one too started to fall. As the books fell from the wooden shelves, he stopped in his fright, holding on to the metal as tightly as he could. Iron slammed against his cheek as he was suddenly flung against it, but he managed to hang on. It was leaning on another bracket at an angle. Peter attempted to ascend despite the high slope. With one foot pressed on the side and the other leaping across the wooden slats, he hopped up. Lower down, he leaped to a rack, then to another, racing down a broad shelf until he was back at ground level. He would have to climb back up to a safe height, but it was not where he wanted to be. Not too far away, a bookcase crashed right in front of him. One followed by another, each one getting closer. He spotted one coming at him when he looked up. The weight of the books and the shelves combined would kill him in a single blow. Instead of pausing, he sprang forward, diving and tumbling over a few straggling books. A few fell over his back, but he persisted, grabbing the unit's ledge in front of him and swinging through above the books it had formerly contained. A call came abruptly, a booming shriek that reverberated across the hallway. It was on the way. Panicking, he searched for the exit once more. He had just been thinking about moving forward, but how far? He wasn't sure he would make it, but he became afraid now that he couldn't see it in this maze of paper. Leaping across the tops of other shelves and jumping between them, he clambered up a diagonally collapsed shelf. He couldn't and wouldn't turn around. It was just a diversion from his escape. Except for a few books that got trapped in its wiry arms, the inside of another shelf, which was positioned at an angle between 2 others, was scattered all over the floor. He pushed against the top of the tall bookshelf he was standing on with a hard jump, expecting to swing from it to the next step, but it shifted away from his foot. Abruptly, he was in free fall, crashing forward into the atmosphere. He landed on a stack of paperbacks with a thump and rolled out to release some of the energy from the fall, but it wasn't enough. He stumbled to his feet, gasping for air as he caught his breath. His muscles burned, his lungs felt like they were on fire, and he was sore. He was injured and battered, but he knew he couldn't quit. He needed to keep going. His feet started to move again, slowly at first, then more quickly. Tall bookshelves continued to rise and fall in front of him, so he was careful to weave in and out of them while keeping a watchful lookout for potential threats above. He was unable to outrun the long unit this time, even though another rack was dropping in his path. Tilting in his direction, it was as long as a warehouse shelving unit and filled with bulky hardbacks. "Oh, screw it!" He screamed and braced himself as he screamed to stop. He shuffled to the side, tucked himself into a squat, and peered between his raised arms to gauge the situation. The racks clattered down around him as he was buffeted by book after book, some of which struck him in the head. He was fortunate enough to be seated just between its shelves, so he wasted no time in scrambling out and sprinting along the route that had been cleared on top of it. However, there was another lengthy unit at its end that appeared to be a wall in front of him and was nearly perpendicular to the recently fallen one. Beyond it, he could see other ledges disintegrating and dropping between the holes in the volumes. He plotted his course while continuing to run as quickly as his exhausted body would permit. As he got closer to the wall of manuscripts, he jumped from the long shelf on top of one that was still rising to his left, bouncing from platform to platform, diving headfirst through a gap, and somersaulting into the unknown beyond. He went down, this time without a place to jump, and fell on another pile of books. Peter slumped to his back and slipped down as his legs crumpled under him. The sound of that wailing getting closer, shelving units being thrown aside, books being pushed out of the way, made him groan in pain, agony, and tiredness, wanting this whole ordeal to end. Now, gasping, he pushed forward, stumbling and hobbling as he searched for that familiar pattern, trying to time his feet to his heart's quick pounding. As he navigated another twisting passage, he discovered it was barred and had to ascend each shelf while the beast continued to close in on him. Despite his darkest fears, he eventually made it to the top and followed the trail that led him back down. A massive tidal wave of books fell to one side, and a metal frame fell as a big metal yawn suddenly sounded. This time, it smashed straight through the concrete, exposing a second level of the labyrinth underneath. In that shadow, amid the flopping of books as they joined it, the concrete clattered and echoed against the floor, and it stretched on into an inky darkness below. There was still a passage off to the side, but he had no choice but to charge ahead, leaping as hard as he could in the direction of the hole, clinging to the twisted metal frame and severing one hand on the sharp metal. As he forced himself higher, forwards, rising, and crawling upwards little by bit with agonizing movements toward the end of the bent metal frame that extended across to the other side, with nothing but a terrible death below, screams began to break out between his breaths. As the beast reached the wall, a hissing scream reverberated throughout the cavern and reverberated in the labyrinth below, but Peter chose not to turn around. He didn't have a second to spare, so it was a diversion. The dusty ancient steps that climbed up against the brick were finally visible to him. Hope has never appeared so ordinary. He persisted despite the mantles and brackets rising and collapsing all around him, the loud thud and rustle of volumes dropping, and more. Above, around, and ultimately near a walkway that is unobstructed save for a scattering of books. The clicking and clattering of the creature's mandibles filled him with panic as he heard frantic, agitated footsteps approaching with full haste from behind. His arms were flailing wildly as his body started to give way, and he kicked a few of the scattered books as he stumbled and staggered towards the stairs at full speed. His foot finally made contact with the thin wooden step, but a claw wildly grasped at his jacket. He tried to pull against it with everything he had left, but it was too strong after his ordeal, so he moved his arms back to slip out of it. The beast continued to scream and wail, but he did not turn around and hurried to the top of the stairs, slamming the door behind him. He fell to the ground in complete tiredness as blood dripped down the white painted paneling. BVVVVVVVVVVZZZT. From the hallway came the electronic buzzing of his apartment doorbell. Peter pushed out of bed with a wheeze, pressing a bandaged hand to his aching head. He threw the sheets away and bent forward, putting on a pair of backless slippers and standing up with the weight of his body. With a moan, he put on a gray tank top with blood stains and walked past the kitchen to his door, where he could see through the foggy peephole. The top of a box was visible at the bottom of the fisheye picture beyond, but no one else was present. Curious, he used his good hand to remove the sleep from his eyes and slid open the chain and turned the lock. He looked left and right into the transitional hallway to see who might have been there. He had no idea what time it was, but sure enough, they had brought a little cardboard box that was unmarked. He picked it up with one hand, carried it back to the kitchen, and idly opened a drawer to retrieve a knife. He cut the brown tape that sealed it carefully. He was too intrigued to stop, even if it smelled a little musty and felt a little grainy to the touch. It was nearly like old times. He looked inside his dimly cool abode and saw bugs, exotic insects of all kinds. It is all dry, level, and preserved. There was a note on top,